It is late 1989. The city of Tokyo is vibrating with a manic, electric energy. In the Ginza district, corporate salarymen are waving 10,000 yen bills just to hail a taxi. At business dinners, gold-flaked sushi is served costing thousands of dollars per head. But the true insanity is hidden in the banks. Ordinary families are signing contracts for multi-generational mortgages. Loans with terms of 100 years. These people are signing away not just their own financial futures, but the futures of their children and their grandchildren. All just to own a tiny concrete apartment in a city that defies economic gravity. At this precise moment, a single statistic captures the world's bewilderment. The land value of the Imperial Palace grounds, a mere 1.15 square kilometers in the center of Tokyo, is estimated to be worth more than all the real estate in the entire state of California. From the beaches of Malibu to the Golden Gate Bridge, the entire Golden State is worth less than one patch of grass in Japan. It seems impossible. But in 1989, the math says it is true. However, history has a cruel way of correcting bad math. Within 12 short months, this glittering party will end in a silence so profound, it will be heard for 30 years. We call this period the lost decades. But how did a nation renowned for its discipline, prudence, and precision lose its mind so completely? To understand the crash, we must first understand the seduction. This is the story of how Tokyo bought the world, and the terrible price it paid for the privilege. To understand the fall, we must appreciate the height of the climb. Following the devastation of World War II, Japan did not just recover. It engineered an economic miracle that remains unrivaled in modern history. Guided by the powerful Ministry of International Trade and Industry, known simply as MITI, Japan constructed a unique form of state-guided capitalism. This was not the free market chaos of the West, but a synchronized machine. The government targeted specific industries like steel, shipbuilding, and later, automobiles and electronics. They funneled capital and talent into them with military precision. By the 1970s and 80s, this machine was unstoppable. Japanese products, once derided as cheap imitations, had become the global gold standard for quality and reliability. In the United States, consumers were abandoning Ford and General Motors for the fuel-efficient reliability of Toyota and Honda. In living rooms across Europe and America, the Sony Trinitron television and the Walkman became symbols of a futuristic lifestyle. Japan was no longer catching up. It was overtaking. This success was built on the iron triangle of big business, bureaucracy, and politics. It was supported by a banking sector that operated on the convoy system, the idea that the government would never let a bank fail, ensuring that credit would always flow to industry. This relentless export engine generated massive trade surpluses. Money was flooding into Japan faster than the country could spend it. The narrative was seductive and seemingly unbreakable. Japan as number one, as Harvard sociologist Ezra Vogel titled his best-selling book. The West watched in a mix of admiration and fear. But beneath the surface of this perfectly calibrated export machine, a vulnerability was growing. The world was beginning to resent Japan's success. And that geopolitical tension was about to trigger a chain of events that would turn this miracle into a nightmare. The catalyst for the bubble was not found in Tokyo, but in New York City. By 1985, the United States was suffering from a massive trade deficit, largely due to the influx of Japanese goods. American manufacturers were lobbying Congress for protectionism. They cried out that the Japanese yen was artificially undervalued, giving Toyota and Sony an unfair advantage. To prevent a trade war, the G5 nations, the US, UK, France, West Germany, and Japan, agreed to meet at the Plaza Hotel in New York on September 22, 1985. The goal was simple, but drastic: intervene in the currency markets to depreciate the US dollar and appreciate the yen. This agreement, known as the Plaza Accord, changed the economic landscape overnight. The results were far more violent than Japanese officials anticipated. In just 2 years, the yen doubled in value against the dollar, soaring from around 240 yen to the dollar to 120. While this was a victory for American diplomacy, it was a catastrophe for Japan's export-driven economy. Suddenly, Japanese products were twice as expensive for foreign buyers. Profits for giants like Nissan and Matsushita evaporated. The specter of an indaka, or high yen, recession loomed over the country, threatening to stall the post-war miracle. Panic set in at the Bank of Japan and the Ministry of Finance. They believed they had to save the export sector at all costs. Their solution was to stimulate domestic demand to offset the loss of exports. The Bank of Japan aggressively slashed the official discount rate, dropping it from 5% to a historic low of 2.5%. Simultaneously, the government exerted pressure on banks to lend more money through window guidance, an informal but binding mechanism where central bank officials dictated lending quotas to commercial banks. This was the pivotal mistake. The intention was to support struggling manufacturers. But because the yen was so strong, companies didn't invest in new factories. Instead, this tsunami of cheap, easy money had to go somewhere else. It flowed away from the real economy of making things and flooded into the financial economy of assets. The Plaza Accord had successfully stopped the trade war. But in doing so, it had opened the floodgates of liquidity. The fuel for the fire had been poured. All that was needed now was a spark. To understand why the bubble inflated so rapidly, we must look at the machinery behind the money. Following the Plaza Accord, the Bank of Japan, or BOJ, was under immense political pressure from the Ministry of Finance to support the export sector. The fear of an Indaka recession was so palpable that the central bank kept the official discount rate at a historic low of 2.5% for over 2 years, from February 1987 to May 1989. But low interest rates were only half the story. The true engine of the bubble was a uniquely Japanese mechanism known as window guidance, or Mataguchi Shido. Unlike Western central banks that influenced the economy indirectly through interest rates, the BOJ in the 1980s operated like a central planner. Every quarter, BOJ officials would summon the heads of commercial banks and literally dictate their lending quotas. During this period, the directive from the central bank was aggressive: increase lending volume at all costs. This put local branch managers in an impossible position. The traditional manufacturing giants, companies like Toyota or Matsushita, were sitting on piles of cash from their export earnings and didn't need loans. Yet, the banks had quotas to fill. If a branch manager failed to lend their quota, they faced career stagnation. Desperate to move money out the door, banks began soliciting customers they would normally reject. They approached small business owners, doctors, and even families with modest incomes, urging them to borrow against their property. This led to the erosion of credit standards. In a sane banking environment, a loan is granted based on the borrower's ability to repay from their cash flow. In late 80s Japan, this principle was abandoned in favor of collateral-based lending. As long as the borrower owned land, the bank would lend. This created a perverse feedback loop. Increased lending allowed more people to buy land, which drove up land prices, which increased the value of the collateral, allowing banks to lend even more. It was a self-reinforcing spiral of debt. At the peak, banks were offering loans worth 120% of the property's value, covering not just the purchase price, but the transaction fees and taxes, assuming the land's appreciation would cover the difference within months. The flood of liquidity didn't just distort banking, it corrupted the very soul of corporate Japan. For decades, the Japanese post-war miracle was built on monozukuri, the art of making things. But in the late 1980s, this was replaced by zeitek, or financial engineering. With the yen strong and export margins squeezed, corporate executives looked at the booming financial markets and realized they could make more money trading money than making cars or cameras. The government unwittingly fueled this by allowing companies to set up token funds. These specified money trusts allowed corporations to hide short-term capital gains from their tax reports, treating stock speculation as a separate, tax-advantaged activity. A classic example of this madness was Hanwha Corp., a steel trading company. Under the leadership of its president, Shigeru Kida, Hanwha became known as the Hanwha Bank. They borrowed trillions of yen to speculate in the stock market. At one point, Hanwha's financial assets were larger than its actual steel trading business. But they weren't alone. Giant manufacturers like Nissan and Sharp were generating 40 to 50% of their pre-tax profits purely from financial arbitrage. They would issue commercial paper or bonds at near-zero interest rates because their stock prices were soaring, and then deposit that money into high-yield accounts or reinvest it in the stock market. This created a dangerous illusion of profitability. Investors looked at the earnings reports and saw record-breaking profits, justifying even higher stock prices. However, these profits were not derived from operational efficiency or product innovation. They were derived from the bubble itself. It was a house of cards built on cross-shareholding, known as keiretsu. Company A would buy shares in Company B. When Company B's stock went up, Company A's assets increased, allowing them to borrow more to buy shares in Company C. As long as the music played, balance sheets looked invincible. But in reality, corporate Japan had stopped being a manufacturing powerhouse and had transformed into a giant, leveraged hedge fund. If the stock market was a casino, the real estate market was a collective hallucination. The land myth, or Tochi Shinwa, became a religious conviction. Because Japan was a mountainous island nation with limited habitable land, People believed prices could physically never go down. This belief was supercharged in 1987 when the government passed the Resort Law. This act offered tax breaks and subsidies for developing leisure facilities in rural areas. Suddenly, every rice paddy and mountain slope was a potential site for a ski resort, golf course, or luxury hotel. Construction companies, flush with loans, paved over the countryside. In Tokyo, the numbers became incomprehensible. In the prime Ginza district, land prices hit over $200,000 per square meter. A simple calculation showed that if you sold the Imperial Palace grounds, you could theoretically purchase the entire state of California. But the insanity wasn't limited to commercial developers. Ordinary families were sucked into the vortex. To afford a home in this market, banks introduced the intergenerational loan. These were 90 or 100-year mortgages, where the debt would explicitly be passed down from father to son. It was a contract of indentured servitude, signed willingly in the panic that, if we don't buy now, we will never own a home. This frenzy fundamentally altered the physical landscape. The Jayagiya, or land sharks, became a terrifying force. These were often Yakuza-backed evictors, hired by developers to clear out tenants from old wooden buildings to make way for gleaming steel towers. They would use intimidation, dump garbage at front doors, or play loud music all night to force elderly residents to sell. Urban planning was abandoned for pure speculation. By 1990, the total value of all land in Japan was estimated to be 4 times the value of all land in the United States, despite the US being 25 times larger. The market had detached completely from the utility of the land. It was now purely a vehicle for speculation. By late 1989, Japan's economic dominance had morphed into cultural and geopolitical hubris. The atmosphere was captured perfectly in the controversial book, The Japan That Can Say No, co-authored by Sony founder Akio Morita and politician Shintaro Ishihara. The book argued that Japan held the technological keys to the future. It explicitly claimed that Japanese chips determined the accuracy of American nuclear missiles, and that Japan should stop bowing to US demands. This confidence manifested in high-profile trophy assets. When Mitsubishi Estate bought a controlling stake in Rockefeller Center in October 1989, for $846 million, it was seen as more than a business deal. To Americans, it was a symbolic conquest. The reaction in the US was hysterical, bordering on xenophobia, with lawmakers calling it a threat to national security. But the Japanese kept buying. Pebble Beach Golf Links, Columbia Pictures, Universal Studios. They bought Impressionist art at Christie's and Sotheby's for prices that left Western billionaires stunned. Ryoi Saito, a paper manufacturing tycoon, famously bought Van Gogh's Portrait of Dr. Gachet for $82.5 million. He later said he wanted the painting cremated with him when he died. On the Tokyo Stock Exchange, the valuations defied logic. At its peak, the market capitalization of NTT, Nippon Telegraph and Telephone, was larger than the entire West German stock market combined. The Nikkei 225 hit its all-time high of 38,915 on December 29, 1989. In the boardrooms of Kabutocho, champagne flowed freely. The P/E ratios of Japanese stocks averaged roughly 60 times earnings, triple that of US stocks. But analysts justified this with exotic metrics like the Q ratio, claiming that Western accounting didn't apply to Japan's superior hidden asset model. They were drunk on their own success, standing on the summit of the world, unaware that the oxygen was running out. The turning point in this tragedy can be traced to a single individual, Yasushi Mino. When he ascended to the governorship of the Bank of Japan on December 17, 1989, the markets initially underestimated him. He was a career insider, nicknamed the Prince, within the central bank. But his philosophy was radically different from his predecessors. Mino believed the bubble was a moral cancer. He saw that skyrocketing land prices were destroying the dream of homeownership for hardworking Japanese and widening the wealth gap to dangerous levels. While the politicians and the Ministry of Finance wanted the party to continue, Mino decided to take away the punch bowl. Known later as the inflation fighter, Mino wasted no time. Just 8 days after taking office, on Christmas Day, 1989, he raised the official discount rate. The market dismissed it as a minor correction. But Mino was relentless. He raised rates again in March, then again in August. In less than a year, he hiked the rate from 2.5% to 6%. This was a shock to the system. The Mino shock effectively tripled the cost of borrowing for the speculators who were leveraged to the hilt. Mino's actions were controversial. He openly sparred with the Ministry of Finance, asserting the central bank's independence for the first time in decades. In press conferences, he spoke bluntly about the need to wring out the excess and bring land prices down by 20 to 30%. He got his wish. But the consequences were far more severe than a simple correction. By aggressively tightening credit, he didn't just cool the market. He froze the liquidity that was keeping the massive Ponzi schemes of Zaytech and real estate alive. He is often blamed for causing the crash. But history views him more as the man who stopped the madness, though the withdrawal symptoms would nearly kill the patient. The crash did not happen in a single day like Black Monday in the US. It was a grinding, agonizing slide. The first trading day of 1990, January 4th, began with a 200 yen drop in the Nikkei. It seemed insignificant, but the selling pressure persisted. By April, the index had plunged to 28,000. By October, it broke below 20,000. In just 10 months, nearly 50% of the market's value, trillions of dollars in wealth, had simply evaporated. Yet, throughout 1990 and 1991, there was a strange lack of urgency. The government and corporate leaders treated this as a temporary, cyclical downturn. This denial birthed a fraudulent practice known as tabashi, meaning to make fly away. Since companies didn't want to report huge losses on their quarterly statements, they conspired with securities firms to sell their bad assets to other companies with different reporting dates, temporarily moving the loss off their books. These bad assets were shuffled around like a hot potato, hiding the true extent of the damage. Everyone believed that the market would eventually bounce back. But because Japan lacked robust bankruptcy laws for a crisis of this magnitude, companies that should have failed were kept alive. The banks, fearing that calling in loans would reveal their own insolvency, simply extended the loan terms. They engaged in forbearance lending. This marked the beginning of the slow-motion nature of the crisis. In the US, a crash is usually followed by a sharp clearing of the market, bankruptcies, fire sales, and a reset. In Japan, the cultural preference for stability and face-saving meant that the pain was not taken all at once. It was spread out over decades. The refusal to acknowledge the losses transformed a sharp recession into a chronic, debilitating disease. While stocks crashed in 1990, land prices held out for a bit longer, creating a false sense of security. But gravity is undeniable. In 1991, the government introduced a new land value tax and a system of total volume control on real estate lending. They wanted to ensure the bubble wouldn't reinflate. This policy finally popped the real estate balloon. The slide began in Tokyo's commercial districts and spread like a contagion. The 6 major cities' land price index began a decline that would not stop for 15 years. The scale of the collapse was biblical. Residential land prices in major cities fell by nearly 50%, while commercial land dropped by up to 80% from the peak. Golf club memberships, once worth millions, became worthless paper. The devastation was unique because of the collateral. In the U.S. housing crisis of 2008, homeowners could often walk away from their mortgages. These are called non-recourse loans. In Japan, mortgages are recourse loans, meaning even if the bank seizes and sells your house, you are still personally liable for the remaining debt. This trapped millions of Japanese families in negative equity. A salaryman who bought a condo for 80 million yen now lived in a home worth 40 million, but he still owed the bank the full 80 million plus interest. His life became a treadmill of servicing debt for an asset that had lost its value. This crushed consumer confidence. Why spend money on dining out or travel when you are technically bankrupt? The destruction of land values also obliterated the balance sheets of corporations. The foundation of the entire economy, land, had turned into quicksand. The aftermath of the crash presented a paradox that puzzled mainstream economists. Interest rates were slashed to zero, yet no one borrowed money. The government pumped cash into the system, yet the money supply didn't grow. It was economist Richard Koo who finally diagnosed the condition, a balance sheet recession. Koo argued that Japan's problem wasn't a typical business cycle downturn. It was that the private sector was collectively insolvent. Imagine a company that has $100 in assets and $90 in debt. It is healthy. Now, imagine the asset bubble bursts. The assets fall to $40, but the debt remains at $90. The company is now technically bankrupt, with a negative net worth of $50. However, the company is still making cars or selling goods. It has cash flow. In this situation, the CEO's priority shifts from profit maximization to debt minimization. The company stops investing, stops hiring, and pours every yen of profit into paying down the debt to fix its balance sheet. This behavior is rational for the individual company. But when every company does it simultaneously, it is a disaster for the macroeconomy. This is called the fallacy of composition. Because the corporate sector became a net saver rather than a borrower, huge amounts of demand were sucked out of the economy. Between 1995 and 2005, Japanese companies paid down debt equivalent to nearly 20% of GDP per year. This massive deleveraging acted as a powerful brake on the economy, canceling out the government's stimulus efforts. Japan was stuck in a liquidity trap, where monetary policy became impotent, because the borrowers had lost the will and the capacity to borrow. The banking sector became the primary casualty of this balance sheet recession. By the mid-90s, the convoy system, where strong banks helped weak ones under government guidance, had completely broken down. The scale of bad loans was simply too massive to hide. The crisis came to a head with the failure of the Juzon companies. These were specialized housing loan corporations that had lent recklessly to speculators. Their collapse in 1996 forced the government to use taxpayer money for a bailout, sparking public outrage. But the rot went deeper. Major banks like the LTCB, the Long-Term Credit Bank of Japan, were essentially insolvent. To avoid admitting this, banks engaged in evergreening. They would lend a struggling construction company enough money to pay the interest on its old loans, keeping the loan classified as performing on paper. This created zombie companies. Firms that were dead in terms of productivity, but kept alive by artificial life support. These zombies were a poison to the economy. They kept prices artificially low, hoarded labor, and blocked new, more efficient competitors from entering the market. Why would a startup enter the construction industry when zombie firms were bidding below cost just to get cash flow? The Japanese government, paralyzed by the fear of unemployment, refused to let these companies fail. It wasn't until the financial crises of 1997 and 1998, when major securities firms like Yamaichi Securities collapsed, that the government finally got serious. They forced banks to write off bad loans. But by then, nearly a decade had been wasted. As the 90s wore on, Japan entered a new, chilling phase: chronic deflation. Prices started falling, and they wouldn't stop. This was driven by the collapse in demand and zombie companies dumping goods. But it also sparked a cultural shift. The rise of 100-yen shops, like Daiso, and the fast fashion giant Uniqlo symbolized this new era. In the bubble years, high price was a signal of quality. In the lost decades, cheapness was the only virtue. Uniqlo's fleece jackets, sold for 1,900 yen, became the uniform of the deflationary age. Deflation sounds good to a consumer. Who doesn't like cheaper clothes? But for an economy, it is lethal. It creates a psychological trap. If you know a car will be 5% cheaper next year, you wait to buy it. This collective wait-and-see psychology grounds economic activity to a halt. To maintain profits with lower prices, companies cut costs, primarily wages. As wages stagnate or fall, consumers spend even less, forcing prices down even further. It is a vicious downward spiral. Crucially, deflation increases the real interest rate. Even if the Bank of Japan sets interest rates at 0%, if deflation is 2%, the real cost of borrowing is 2%. This means monetary policy can never be loose enough. Furthermore, deflation increases the real burden of debt. A 100 million yen loan taken in 1990 feels much heavier in 2000. If wages and prices have dropped by 10%, Japan became the first modern economy to grapple with this trap. Policymakers were utterly unprepared, having spent their entire careers fighting inflation, not deflation. Just as Japan needed maximum economic dynamism to grow out of its debt, it hit a demographic wall. In 1990, the country was shocked by the 1.57 shock. The fertility rate dropped to a record low of 1.57. But the real damage was already baked into the cake. The working-age population, those aged 15 to 64, peaked in 1995 at 87 million. And then began a relentless decline. This meant that every year, there were fewer people to work, pay taxes, and consume goods. This demographic shift turned the demographic dividend that fueled the post-war miracle into a demographic tax. The population pyramid inverted. The cohort of retirees grew rapidly, demanding more pensions and healthcare, funded by a shrinking pool of workers. This explosion in social security costs forced the government to run deficits just to keep the system floating, regardless of any stimulus spending. The impact on the real estate market was permanent. In a growing population, demand for housing increases naturally. In a shrinking one, the number of empty houses, known as ikiya, multiplies. Entire new towns built in the bubble era turned into ghost towns, as the elderly remained, and the young left for Tokyo. This structural headwind meant that even if the banks were fixed, and companies paid off their debt, the potential growth rate of Japan was mathematically destined to fall. You simply cannot have high GDP growth with a shrinking workforce, unless productivity skyrockets. Which, in a zombie-infested economy, it did not. The economic statistics hide the human tragedy of the employment ice age, or Shishoka Hyogaki. For graduates leaving university between 1993 and 2004, the door to the middle class was slammed shut. Japanese corporate culture is rigid. Companies traditionally hire fresh graduates once a year in April for lifetime employment, or shushin koyo. If you miss that window, you are tainted. Because companies couldn't fire existing staff due to labor laws, they adjusted by simply cutting new hires to zero. This created a massive cohort of freeders, or freelance part-timers. These were highly educated young people, forced to work at convenience stores or on short-term contracts. With no benefits. And no bonuses. Their lifetime earnings were slashed by 30 to 40% compared to the generation before them. Without financial security, they delayed marriage and children, further exacerbating the low birth rate. The despair peaked in 1998, a dark year, when the suicide rate in Japan jumped by 35%, surpassing 30,000 deaths per year. A grim statistic that stayed high for over a decade. A distinct social phenomenon emerged from this hopelessness, hikikomori. Estimated to number over 1 million at its peak, these were mostly young men who, crushed by the pressure to succeed in a broken system, withdrew into their bedrooms. They cut ties with the outside world, supported by their aging parents, playing video games, and surfing the internet. It was a silent protest against a society that had no place for them. The lost generation is now entering their 40s and 50s. Many are still unmarried and working contract jobs. A ticking time bomb for the future welfare system. Desperate to simulate the growth of the past, the Liberal Democratic Party turned to the only tool they knew, construction. Japan became a dokonkaka, or construction state. In the 1990s, Japan consistently spent more on public works than the United States, despite having half the population and a fraction of the land area. The goal was to use Keynesian stimulus to jumpstart the economy. But the execution was driven by political patronage, rather than economic necessity. Vast sums of money, hundreds of trillions of yen, were poured into rural infrastructure. They concreted riverbanks that didn't need reinforcement, built airports in towns with no passengers, and constructed multi-lane highways through mountains, used only by badgers. These projects became known globally as bridges to nowhere. While they kept rural construction workers employed and voters loyal, the economic multiplier effect was near zero. The money did not circulate. It was swallowed by inefficient construction firms and saved, not spent. The legacy of this failure is a monstrous national debt. Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio ballooned from a healthy 60% in 1990 to over 260% today, the highest in the developed world. The government effectively substituted private debt for public debt. They took the bad loans off the corporate balance sheets and put them onto the taxpayer's credit card. It proved a painful economic lesson. You cannot build your way out of a structural crisis with concrete. As long as the private sector is deleveraging, government spending is just a temporary painkiller, not a cure. By 2012, Japan had endured 2 decades of stagnation. Enter Shinzo Abe for his second term as prime minister. He wielded a radical policy package branded Abenomics. Abe argued that Japan's deflation was a psychological mindset that could only be broken by shock and awe. His strategy relied on 3 arrows. First, aggressive monetary policy. Second, flexible fiscal policy. And third, structural reform. The first arrow was the most potent. Abe appointed Haruhiko Kuroda as BOJ governor. Kuroda launched a bazooka of stimulus. The central bank committed to doubling the monetary base in 2 years. They bought up government bonds and, controversially, equity ETFs. They effectively nationalized the stock market to force prices up and create a wealth effect. The goal was an explicit 2% inflation target. And for a while, it seemed to work. The yen weakened significantly, a boon for exporters like Toyota. The Nikkei index rallied from 8,000 to over 20,000. Corporate profits hit record highs. However, the second and third arrows missed the mark. Just as the economy was gaining momentum, the government raised the consumption tax in 2014 from 5% to 8%, and again in 2019 to 10%. They did this to pay down the national debt. But it crushed consumer spending, instantly killing the inflation Abe was trying to generate. Furthermore, structural reforms were watered down by special interest groups. The result? Corporate Japan got rich. But the average worker didn't. Wages adjusted for inflation actually fell during much of the Abenomics era. The virtuous cycle of higher profits leading to higher wages never materialized. Today, Japan exists in a strange economic twilight. The crisis is over, but the recovery never really came. Instead, the country has settled into a new normal. Low growth, low inflation, and low interest rates. The Bank of Japan has engaged in yield curve control, or YCC, pledging to buy unlimited bonds to keep the 10-year interest rate near zero. This has resulted in the central bank owning over 50% of all Japanese government bonds. The market is effectively dead. The government is borrowing from itself. This stability has come at a cost: ossification. Japan, once the leader in technology, missed the digital revolution. While Silicon Valley created the iPhone and the internet, Japanese tech giants held onto flip phones and fax machines. This phenomenon is known as the Galapagos syndrome, evolving in isolation from the rest of the world. The business culture remains risk-averse. Startups are rare because failure is still socially stigmatized. Yet, life in Japan is surprisingly comfortable. Unemployment is low, crime is non-existent, and the trains run on time. It is a wealthy, declining society that is managing its descent with grace. The world now looks at Japan not as a failure, but as a pioneer. Europe and parts of Asia are beginning to see their own populations age and their growth slow. They are asking, are we turning Japanese? Japan has become the world's laboratory for a post-growth economy, proving that a country can remain stable and functional, even as it slowly shrinks. The story of Japan is not just history, it is a warning. Today, the parallels between 1990 Tokyo and the current global superpowers are terrifyingly distinct. In China, we see the ghost of Japan's bubble in high definition. The Chinese real estate sector, exemplified by the collapse of Evergrande, accounts for nearly 30% of the country's GDP. Similar to Japan at its peak, China faces a balance sheet recession with high corporate debt, a rapidly aging population exacerbated by the one-child policy, and a geopolitical struggle with the US that echoes the trade wars of the 80s. The United States is not immune either. While US demographics are healthier, its asset markets display the same symptoms of financialization that plagued Japan. The national debt is skyrocketing. Stock market valuations are stretched to historic highs, supported by a decade of easy money from the Federal Reserve. We even see the rise of zombie companies in the Russell 2000 index, kept alive by low interest rates. The Japanification of the global economy seems to be underway. Central banks everywhere are trapped in a cycle of printing money to support asset prices, fearing that if they stop, the system will collapse. Japan teaches us that once you start using debt to cover up structural problems, you cannot stop. You can buy time. Japan bought 30 years of stability, but you simply push the reckoning into the future. The lost decades show that when the bubble bursts, the cleanup takes a generation. The world is now looking in the mirror, and the reflection is wearing a kimono. The tragedy of Japan's asset bubble is a story of how success can sow the seeds of destruction. It wasn't failure that killed the Japanese economy. It was the arrogance of success. The belief that Japan is different, that trees could grow to the sky, and that debt didn't matter, led a rational nation into collective madness. The recovery was long, because the disease was deep. It wasn't just a financial correction. It was a psychological dismantling of the post-war identity. Japan had to learn that land values can fall, that banks can fail, and that populations can shrink. The lost decades were the price paid for the wild excess of the late 80s. But perhaps the most important lesson is for us, the viewers. Bubbles are not accidents of nature. They are created by policy, fueled by greed, and sustained by denial. Whether it is crypto, AI stocks, or housing in your local city, the dynamics are always the same. When you hear that this time is different, remember the salaryman in Ginza waving 10,000 yen bills for a taxi. Remember the 100-year mortgages. The laws of economics, like gravity, are patient. They always claim their due. I'd love to hear your perspective. Looking at the indicators we discussed today, interest rates, corporate debt, and demographics, do you see similar warning signs in your own country's economy right now? Please share your observations in the comments below. If you found value in this investigation and want to support independent, documentary-style storytelling, please consider subscribing to Stratum Logic. Your support allows us to continue deconstructing complex history and economics. Thank you for deep thinking with us.